am hoping to bring some interesting information closer to you today about childbirth and childhood in the Norse world. I changed the title a little bit because I think it's fairer to designate it like this, in the Norse world. And why that is, I'll explain to you in a second. Well, essentially, because in this presentation I will be using sources from the Old West Norse world, so essentially Iceland and Norway, and most of the sources I'm using are unfortunately post-Viking, so let's say early medieval, and I'm referring here to the family sagas, although I also use the legendary sagas in my research, but I will also be using some legal texts, some Eddic poetry, and some references to archaeological reports as well. Now, there is always the problem of later medieval sources when discussing the issue of the Viking Age. I would say that these sources are impossible not to use if we're interested in cultural history, in history of the mentalities and so on. Of course, archaeology can give us a lot of information about what people ate, how they lived their lives, whether they were healthy or not, how they died, and so on and so forth. But if we're interested in cultural history, social history, and so on, I think it is safe to use the family sagas because, at least in part, Icelanders did tend to reuse their past or have a deep connection with their past, and they also based quite a lot their stories on older narrative traditions. So there is a grain of truth in these sources as well. So we'll be talking a little bit about pregnancy and childbirth afterwards, about social integration, and about something which has been a very interesting topic in this discussion, which is infanticide and exposure, and some details about what the life of children would have been in the Viking Age and in the early Middle Ages in Scandinavia. So for starters, I will introduce to you Frøydis Eiríksdóttir. The ones of you who watch Vikings may know her from Vikings Valhalla, I think. She's the daughter of Eiríkur from the Vinland sagas. She appears both in the saga of Erik the Red, Erik Saga Rauða, and also the saga of the Greenlanders, the Grönlendinga saga. And she's very interesting because she is a character who is pregnant. So in the saga of Erik the Red, she is shown as traveling through a forest. She runs away from some enemies. She is with her companions in North America, and they have these very problematic encounters with the locals, and a band of natives attacks them, and they manage to kill some of her companions, and the other ones basically leave her behind. However, she turns to be very ruthless. She refused to give in without a fight, and perhaps instinctually, in order to protect her unborn child, she does whatever the case is, which is to take a sword just lying by one of the bodies, and she then takes her bare breast out of her tunic and slaps the sword on her breast. And this has a pretty terrifying effect on the natives because they run off. So the woman escapes the attack unscathed and manages to find those of her companions who did get away unharmed. So, of course, such a representation is to be taken with a very large grain of salt. Realistically speaking, a woman on the verge of giving birth wouldn't have been that much of a threat to anyone, essentially. However, we should think of it as an example of showing women with the pregnant body deciding their own fate and choosing to fight. So they're not only proud and nurturing and protective of their children, but there are also some social expectations from them regarding their relationship, their future relationship to their children. So they need to display ruthlessness and strength in such situations as well, because we are talking here about a society in very harsh conditions and circumstances. Women's lives in the Viking Age, well, we do tend to have this idea about, equal rights and some progressive ideas transferred somehow in the past. This was not really the case. Women's lives in the Viking Age and in medieval times were to a large extent reduced to reproductive capacities. First and foremost, you were supposed to be sexually active and fertile, and as such, you were also likely to be pregnant. And that wouldn't have been necessarily a great experience for you, because that would have also meant a great strain on your body and a prolonged strain on your body, associated aches, pains, anxieties, depressions that were not acknowledged as such, and no modern medicine, obviously. So it was important for women to bear children, and the importance of this is also shown in some myths and legends. For example, if we go to the saga of the Volsungs, which is the Norse version of the Song of the Nibelungs on the continent, we will find the example of the mother of Volsung, the legendary hero. She cannot beget a child, so she experiences infertility, and then after years of failing to conceive, the goddess Frigg, to whom she prays, essentially answers her prayers for a child, and she bears Volsung, gives birth to him. But this is a very special birth because it happens some years after conception, so it's a very strenuous birth. But this also is in reference to the fact that we're dealing with a hero, so we're kind of expecting this sort of exceptionality. Moving on to a more mundane realm, we can say that childbirth in the Viking Age and medieval times was characterized by a high mortality, and here I'm referring both to children and to mothers. You would have expected a lot of miscarriages as well, and you would have expected a child every 24 to 30 months. So quite a lot of children. So your life was basically reduced to recovering between births. And the lack of recovery time was also an issue, because we have a lot of accounts in the sagas where women just randomly pop up and they just request for like a couple of minutes, or I don't know, half an hour to give birth, and then they go back to work like immediately, which is again not that realistically. However, you would have expected women to like return to whatever it is they were doing as soon as possible. And also interestingly, and I will get back in more detail to that later, is the fact that the father's obligations were actually taken into account only after birth. So it was the mother who was dealing with all the pain and anxiety and so on, but the father's obligations were only enforced after birth. Another interesting aspect you're going to notice in the stories is that midwifery was a specialized skill, or seems to have been a specialized skill. And the Book of Settlements, the Landnoma book from Iceland, even relates an incident about a certain Irish bondswoman of royal descent brought to the island by Unr, the deep-minded. And she was freed on the condition that she care for her granddaughter with the same devotion she had taken care of her former mistress and baby. Generally speaking, giving birth is treated in quite a simplistic manner. It is said that giving birth is something similar to becoming lighter, and speaking of which, not getting pregnant, but showing your belly would have been accompanied by symptoms such as she was feeling unwell, or she was not doing well. So something extremely vague, but from this vagueness we can actually deduce that we are talking about a pregnant woman. And then when she gave birth, she all of a sudden became lighter. There are also some references about impurity and impurity after birth, and this we find in Christian law quite a lot. Women not being allowed to go back to church right after birth, but the easiness with which these legislations were accepted might induce the idea that perhaps impurity after birth was not only a Christian thing, it might also have been a pagan thing. You can find it in a lot of other cultures and religions as well. Well, what I find most interesting in what I've read so far are the potential healing spells, although there is not much to say about them. So here I'm going to quote to you from a couple of poems from the Poetic Edda. The Poetic Edda, I remind you, is this a collection of mythological poems. It was written in the 1200s, but the poems are older than that, some of them even 200, 300 years older. And here you can find both mythological poems and heroic poems. So one of these heroic poems is Sigurdrífumál. This is a poem about the Valkyria Sigurdrífa, or Brynhildr, as she's known from the saga of the Volsungs. She is basically giving some advice to the hero Sigurdur, and oddly enough, she also speaks of the Bjargrunar, which are the birth runes or the helping runes. So she tells Sigurd, Bjargrunar skal du kunna ef du bjargar vild, og lausa kind frá konum. Og lofum þær skal rísta og of líðu spenna og bidja þó dísir duga. So yeah, birth runes you should know if you want to assist and release children from women. They shall be cut on the palms and clasped on the joints, and then the Disir asked for help. Disir are some female deities. There is not really a clear distinction with regard to other female deities like the Nornir or the Valkyriur. They're kind of mixed up in the sources. But yeah, here we have an example of a male who gets some advice about what to do in case of birth. So he should know birth runes, and this is not the only source we find this reference. If we go a little further, we have the poem Fafnismál. Fafnir is the dragon Sigurd battles, and then there is the story about him eating his heart and gaining access to a lot of knowledge and foresight and so on. And as the dragon lies dying, he imparts on Sigurd a lot of knowledge, and one piece of it, or one information Sigurd is eager to know, is about childbirth. So he says here, Segðu mér Fafnir, alls þig fróðan kveða og vel marg vita, hverjar og þær Nornir náð gönglar rú og kjósa meður frá mögum. So Fafnir, tell me, they say you are very wise and knowledgeable. Who are these Norns who take care of childbirth and choose who mothers that child, who gives birth to that child? So here we have a reference to these deities associated with destiny, the Nornir, potentially Urdverðandi and Skuld, the three classical ones from Eddic mythology, although author Snorri Sturluson says that we actually all have a Norn, some kind of pagan, guardian angel of some sort, designing our fate from birth. And the third poem I wanted to show you is one lesser known. It is the Lament of Oddrun, Oddrunargrótr. It is a lesser known poem because it seems to be later, and it doesn't really seem to be part of the canon legend of the Volsung. Oddrun is a sister of Brynhild and Attila, who has a pretty ill-fated love affair with Gunnar, with Brynhild's husband. And in the poem, Oddrun assists another woman called Borgny in giving birth to twins. And this is the only reference we have to birth and birth runes. And then she goes on to tell her tragic story. So in stanza 7, we have the following information. Ferhik meldu þykit fleira, gegnmild fyrkne, meju at sitja, ríkt gol Oddrun, ramd gol Oddrun, bitra galdra at Borgniu. So nothing more was said about this. Oddrun sat gently near Borgny. She sang loudly and powerfully. She sang great spells for Borgny. And after she deals with these enchantments, after she sings the great spells, then Borgny can give birth to her twins. Despite these resources, which are very interesting in the sense that they do give us a hint that people might have actually used spells in such an important event such as childbirth, we don't really know what kind of spells they used. We have no reference whatsoever what runes they use of the sort. We do have historical runic spells, indeed, but we don't have this particular example about what spells they might have used in order to induce birth or in order to ease in it. All right, moving on, let's talk a little bit about what happened after you gave birth. So, as we said before, the woman was responsible for the biological birth, and the father didn't really play an important part while the woman was pregnant. Actually, women became aware they were pregnant very late, and sometimes, actually quite often, men only knew after they told them. So if the woman chose to inform him and he accepted paternity, his obligations often took effect only after birth, and mainly of financial nature. So they basically had to take care of the children and support them until they were about 16 years old. In the meantime, the mother was the one who should have put up with all the unpleasantness after birth, and the security of a partner was not always taken for granted. Married women were definitely better off in this case, but a child could also have been, a reminder of something much more unpleasant, such as rape or an unwanted marriage or an unwanted relationship, and so on and so forth. Or they could have represented a danger to the mother's life. But all in all, marriage was important in order to deal with this whole situation. And from a more pagan point of view, we can say that marriage was this kind of stable association providing transfer of property. And that's why women actually did have rights in transferring this property. It wasn't really about the fact that women were equal to men. It was about how to divide property, because at least some part of property should have stayed in your family. So this would have been the ideal case, this stable association between families, networking, and so on. But the realities were much more complex. You will find in the sources a lot of examples about illegitimacy, concubinage, and so on and so forth. All kinds of illegitimate relationships and so on. The church definitely played a part in regulating all this stuff, inflicting. I won't say inflicting damage to the traditional family, but making it more traditional than it was before. We have, for example, Bishop Magnus in the 13th century, and he was very preoccupied by this, focusing a lot on this issue of illegitimacy. So we can find examples here about women who gave birth to illegitimate children who were discriminated against. For example, they were not allowed to go back to church straight away and use a lighted candle. And some of these regulations also referred to other contexts, for example, the corpses of women who died in childbirth, but women who were not married. So the bodies could be brought to church, for example, only if a midwife would go first with the candle. So such little details show us that the church was really trying to impose its own will with regard to how to regulate childbirth and how to regulate the place of women. And we have a lot of examples in the law, actually. The church did do something good, nevertheless, in the sense that it ensured, at least from a moral point of view, it ensured that every child should have at least the right to a father. Whether that happened or not, of course, that's a matter of different realities and different contexts. But in the Frostating law, for example, the early Norwegian laws, it is stated very clearly that every child has the right to a father. And this father should be the one who named the child. This was actually the pagan custom. The child was brought to the father, and the father had to name the child. And this whole ritual with the naming, this essentially integrated the child into society and ensured the child had a personhood, had a status in society. So, for example, in Vattula saga, it is mentioned about the son of Ingimundur, that he was carried to his father, and the father was to decide on the name. And this habit was also accompanied by the sprinkling of water. We have references, for example, in Harhar saga, but in other sagas as well. And this would seem to have also been not only a Christian ritual, but also a pagan one, especially among a pagan royalty, or at least among chieftains or farmers that were a little better off. And in the Grey Goose law, this is a law from Iceland, the Grógós, it is stated that it was called murder when children were killed after water had been poured over them. So this is kind of, again, a mix-up of customs. On the one hand, we have baptism, and on the other hand, we have these older pagan habits with the father sprinkling water and naming the child, and thus integrating him into society. And actually, namelessness was extremely rare in the stories. Usually, the few examples we have, you are going to find them in legend. And I'm thinking here, for example, about the hero Helgi. There is a poem, Helgakviða. The first poem of Helgi. And here it is stated that no name could stick to him, to the hero Helgi, Hjörvarssonar. And no name could stick to him because a Valkyria was supposed to come to name him so that he could become this hero, this great hero, and then take his place into society. But then again, I repeat, this was quite rare. Usually a child had to have a name, and in the sense we can consider birth, all in all, a process. On the one hand, a biological process, and here the mother was the one involved, and also a social process by the sole acquiring of personhood, and here the father was actually the one responsible. Now, unmarried women, they definitely had a more difficult situation to deal with. They were essentially forced to seek out the father. They were forced to journey to the father, even if the father was, I don't know, someone on the move or in a different country, and she should have given birth nearby to determine him to accept the child. So we have one example from the 10th century where Thora, who is impregnated by King Harald Fairhair, traveled to the king when she neared her term, and she was taken on board on a ship, and she did not reach the king in time. But luckily, there was this earl who sprinkled the boy with water and called him Håkon after his own father. So the problem was basically solved. This was important. It was very important to acknowledge the father and determine the father to acknowledge the child, because the father of an illegitimate child was responsible for its maintenance until the age of 16. And if he did not accept the child, then the relatives of the woman should have taken care of the child, which was a little unpleasant thing to do, especially because of the general bad financial situation. The law sought, however, to protect paternal and maternal relatives against reproductive excesses, so to speak, in the sense that someone could be made responsible for supporting only the first two of the illegitimate offspring. So then again, we always need to think about the general poverty in this region. That's why it was very important to clarify these relationships, so that we can know for a fact who had the responsibility for the child. And the advent of Christianity came with more rules and regulations, even regulations regarding ordeal in order to test paternity suits. Well, this essentially meant that, the woman could make a claim that somebody is her child's father by, for example, retrieving a stone from a boiling kettle, and a father could deny this by, I don't know, trial by the hot iron, for example. So you could also find such trials by ordeal in church law. In Iceland, a woman was obligated to identify the father of her unborn child if her guardian asked her specifically to do so. And if she refused, again, Grogos mentions that the guardian was entitled even to beat her, but not too bad, like beat her in a moderate amount, so that she can keep healthy afterwards, so without leaving wounds or any blue marks. So yeah, all kinds of fun things around this society. The father, on the other hand, did have the right to reject the child, and if he did that, it would have been pretty hard on the child. A wife definitely had a better chance of having her child approved than would a mistress. If a father refused the child, it would have been taken into consideration the child's sex, the health of the child, its looks, a lot of factors, as a matter of fact, and even the feelings the father had towards the mother could have influenced the decision. And if the child was refused by the father, then the child would have been exposed. So taken out of doors and exposed to nature. This is a very delicate topic, but we have to deal with it because all the sources indicate that this was actually a reality. On the other hand, I also think it would be wrong to assume these people were all mass murderers of children. So with regards to the frequency, I don't think it was that frequent, but I do think that it did happen. And it did happen in a lot of traditional societies, as a matter of fact. There are a lot of children who are saved in the sagas as well, but this is generally in order to for the story to move on, because these children would play an important part in the narrative afterwards, and there are also aspects of prophecy, magic involved, feuding, vendettas, and all the fun things we find in Icelandic society. For example, in the saga of Gunnlaug Serpenttung, Gunnlaug's saga Omstungu, we have Thorstein, who is a rich man belonging to a prominent aristocratic family in Iceland, and he has this dream, this prophetic dream, in which two eagles kill each other while a swan looks at them. And his companion interprets this dream, suggesting that it concerns the fate of his future child, his unborn baby girl, who was actually the swan from the dream, and her two suitors, who will die as a result of fighting over her hand in marriage. And the father becomes very worried about this future violence, so his solution is to have the child killed. And this comes as a complete shock to his wife. And when the girl is born, Thorstein is away, and Jofríður, his wife, actually disobeys his orders, and she just sends the daughter to her paternal aunt, who lives in another district, and the child is raised in secret for 6 years. But then again, he discovers the whole thing, Thorstein, as he meets at his sister's house. And he sees his own daughter, and he's very impressed with her. Helga is a very beautiful girl, and then he admits his previous error of judgment, and she grows up to be one of the most beautiful and eligible young women in Iceland. But as you probably suspect, the prophecy does come true. Here you have an example about the anxieties surrounding children and the advent of children in family sagas in particular. The advent of Christianity does play a part in the development of events, especially after the activity of Olaf the Saint, so the Saint King of Norway. And we have a reference, for example, in the Book of Settlements, in the Book of Iceland, historian Ari Þorgilsson describes the voluntary acceptance of Christianity in the year 1000, saying that everyone should be Christian and undergo baptism, and those in the country, even those in the country who are still unbaptized, they accepted some particular habits in order for Christianity to be accepted. For a particular amount of time, they accepted child exposure and horse meat, and also private rituals. Yes, this is what happened at the beginning, but it was very short-lived, because after a few years, heathenism, so at least public heathenism, including child exposure, was actually abolished. So every child that is born should be brought to baptism as soon as possible, regardless of its circumstances, regardless of how deformed it was, regardless of other conditions that would have made him unacceptable in pagan society. So in Iceland, this change occurred very, very fast. This had a lot to do, by the way, with some connections between local chieftains, such as Gissur, who accepted baptism from the missionary of Olaf, and he would have also been told about the importance of infant baptism, and his missionary also spoke a lot about the great sin infanticide represents. So Olaf and Gissur must have come to some kind of agreement. At any rate, Icelanders were actually aware of this Christian attitude towards the issue before the year 1000, and despite these several years where this practice was still tolerated in order to facilitate the transition, it was ultimately abolished. This was not the case in Norway, because in Norway it took a while before child exposure was completely off the record. We have not that much information about Olaf's Christian law. At any rate, it was formulated in the first decades of the 11th century, but the extant parts are embedded in the Gulathing law, which was written in the 13th century, and then combined with the legislation of Magnus Erlingsson, drawn up in the middle of the 12th century. Anyway, the point here is that the laws of two kings merged, but on a number of issues dealing with sexual, marital, and reproductive questions, they did not agree. And we find, for example, a reference in chapter 21, and here it is stated that Magnus revoked this in part. So this refers to the fact that every child born in our country is to be nourished, but there is an exception here, and I'm quoting, "unless it is born with such deformity that the face is turned where the back of the neck should be, or the toes where the heels should be. Such a child must be taken into church and be converted to from paganism and laid down in the church and left to die." So you also find this kind of reference. This law, the Gulathing law, indicates that Olaf the Saint did not have the same success or immediate success in Norway, but was forced to accommodate for a longer time the tradition of infanticide. But then Magnus felt strong enough about this aspect as well in order to modify this legislation, that is, to actually revoke it. Other laws talking about this practice are the Borgarthing law and the Eithvatting law, for example. And here again we have some similar but also dissimilar traditions, because the Borgarthing law says, for example, that children with animal features such as seal fins and dog heads were to be buried alive, and those with facial hair were to be taken to church and blessed. And it is exactly the other way around if we look in Eithvatting law. So ultimately, we can say that the punishment for infanticide underwent an evolution in Norway, which demonstrates an increase in the aggressiveness of Christian policy in this period. And in the Gulathing law, for example, this penalty would have been under the king's jurisdiction, whereas in the Frostating law, this would have been under the church's jurisdiction. There was a fine to be paid to the bishop, as well as a penance to be done if you committed such a crime. So instead of forcing the parents to raise all children, regardless of the physical shape and health status, Norwegian leaders started slower than in Iceland, and they did not include all newborn children in this obligation from the very beginning, but it was rather a more gradual process. And this might have a little bit to do with demographics, in the sense that, okay, both Norway and Iceland at the time were kind of secluded, in the sense that you had small communities living in valleys or on the coast. But I think a little bit more genetic diversity was to be found in Iceland, because for example, the Celtic element is much more present in Iceland. A lot of settlers or slaves and so on also came from the British Isles, so it would have been a little more diversity in the genetic pool. So such cases of deformity would have been rarer than in Norway. So this would be an explanation. I'm not sure about it, but it is a hypothesis about the difference between these legislations and their evolution. The next interesting aspect I wanted to talk a little bit about was fosterage. Fosterage is important in family sagas because the relationship between foster parents and children are essentially on the same level as between biological parents and children. And this practice was very much regulated by law. It was a legal practice, and it was a very highly recommended practice in order to negotiate with other families for the sake of networking, for the sake of increasing prestige, and so on and so forth. So in the Grey Goose Law, for example, you will find that legal fostering is when a man takes a child of 8 and brings him up until he is 16. And 8 here, this is a definition of winter, so age was counted in winters rather than anything else. So 8 winters, although age in this time would have also been a little more relative than now. So they would have had an idea about how old they were, but maybe not in absolute terms like nowadays. So why was fosterage important? It was important because, I repeat, for the sake of networking. It was also important for establishing allegiances, especially in the case of Iceland, where, by the way, this whole idea of an extended family, including your grandparents and ancestors and a whole lineage, complex genealogy, was more specific to the legendary sagas, where we have the term "at" designating it, and it was a little more compromise-based in the family sagas. So that's why you don't really have this idea of nuclear family. So family could mean the household plus your foster parents and whoever was involved in your upbringing and who had contacts with you. So this was also important for the sake of apprenticeship. You could learn something useful from your foster parents, and it was also important for the lower class, because these were jobs for the lower class. So usually parents of higher status gave their children to be raised by people of lower class, and in this way a relationship was formed. And foster parents can have very ambiguous roles in the saga. So you can find very loyal ones. For example, in Egil's saga Skallagrimsson, you will find Thorgerd Brok. She is the one who actually saves Egil from his own father, because his father Skallagrim can also go in a berserker rage, which is exactly something that he does one time when he attacks his own son, because he doesn't recognize him in his berserker rage. And here the bondswoman Brok comes to his rescue, and then she tries to escape Skallagrim, but she doesn't succeed in doing that, and she's actually killed because of this. So she gives her life in order to save Egil. Other times, however, they are not that noble, and we have an example from the saga of Njol. Here we have a very well-known character by the name of Hallgerður. She is a woman with a very problematic status. She is married 3 times, and all her 3 husbands end up dead, and the first 2 end up dead because her foster father, Thjostolfur, kills them. And the second time he does that, let's say, okay, the first time it was because her husband slapped her, but the second time he really had absolutely no reason to do that. He just turns up to her home uninvited, and he is clearly unwelcome, and then we expect her to send him on his way now that she has another husband who cares for her, but she does not do that, and Thjostolfur ends up killing her second husband. So this is also indicative of a potential sexual desire here in this particular case. And I found another interesting example showing this ambiguous status of the foster parents. We have, again in Norse saga, another character, an older woman by the name of Saun, who lives in the household of Njol, and she's actually the one making the prophecy of doom. She tells the household that there is some weed lying around the house, and this will be the cause of great damage, but everyone ignores her. However, she is right, because it is this weed exactly, so these weeds, that will be set on fire and cause the death of Njol and Bergthora, his wife, and the whole household. Cause the whole household to fall. In Grettir's saga, again, you can find an example of a foster mother who performs magic. Grettir is an outlaw. He has a lot of enemies. One of these enemies is Thorbjorn, who at the end of the saga, towards the end of the saga, wants to see Grettir dead, but he cannot find him, and then he asks for help from his mother, who is very well taught in the old ways, in the old pagan ways, and she does some magic rituals with some runes carved and then sprinkled with her blood, and she manages to get hold of Grettir. So all kinds of roles of foster parents to be noticed here. Well, essentially we can say that the sagas pretty much focus on not exactly on children, but when children become adults, or adult behavior in children, not particularly on the activities of children. That is rarer to see. In this sense, this is also because children in medieval times were actually adults at puberty, so they were expected by the age of, let's say, 15, 16, to become adults. Girls when marrying, for example, or boys at any rate when they were able to fight. They were also expected to share the workload, and you can imagine we're dealing with a farm society, and Viking society and medieval society were not that different from any other pre-industrial structure. There was a lot of work to do because they also lived in very complex households, and it was absolutely essential for them to take part in all the chores, in all the activities that parents were also involved in, with, of course, dangers as well. But it was not only unpleasantry in growing up as a Viking or as an Icelander or Norwegian in the, let's say, 10th to 11th century. They also had toys. Some toys were retrieved. You could find in the archaeological record boats, for example, or swords, or even some dolls. This is from the from Ørland, from Norway, and for example, we have here from the National Museum of Ireland a wooden horse. This is also something that comes up every once in a while in the archaeological context. Or they could also play games, but this is, again, something adults also did, so not a lot of difference between children's activities and the activities of adults. We have here a gaming board, so you can see that the toys of children actually reflected the activities they will engage in later as adults. So not much difference here, as a matter of fact. All right, so essentially, like I said before, children were dependent on parents, or generally speaking on guardians, until they were about 16 years old. Their age, of course, was a little relative, and it is rather related to abilities, to what they could do, rather than, in absolute terms, how many winters you managed to survive. Something that comes up quite a lot, especially in the legendary sagas, refers to males, and males especially between the ages of 12 and 15, because this is a liminal age. It's the age where you have to start to demonstrate your manliness and your strength, and you really have to grow up as a masculine hero, as a dranger. Yeah, so this reflects a lot the anxieties youngsters would have had, teenagers would have had in such stories. In the sagas, we have a lot of remarkable individuals, but a lot of the examples are actually used in order to show us what was not typical for the age. So it's very useful to study them in order to figure out what was considered typical, what was considered non-typical, what was appropriate, what was not appropriate. At any rate, we find the importance of the age 12 and the age 16. For example, in the Grey Goose law, there is impunity for murder. In one manuscript, there is the age of 12, and in the other manuscript, it is the age of 16. The age of 16 seems to have been important for boys, because boys at 16 would be able to claim inheritance, prosecute a case for killing, choose a household, and take up cases retrospectively, even. So pretty much what adults used to do. And girls at 16 did actually enjoy some rights of their own. They could also claim inheritance and income from properties, but full access to these rights was after marriage. So you were definitely much better off if you married. You were expected actually to marry not at 16 but earlier than 16, and it was actually when you got married that you were considered a woman. So the transition from childhood to adulthood was complete, so to speak. All right, so coming back to this idea a little bit, we find these two ages in the sagas, which are important, 12 and then 15, sometimes 16, although 16 comes up more often in legal texts. But first and foremost, we have the age of 12. This is the age when many elite males are identified as doing masculine things that were expected from them, and they're doing these things for the first time, and they get noticed for them. For example, in Laxdœla saga, Olaf Peacock gets noticed because of his attire, so his dress. He is dressed very fine, very proper, and so on. Another thing that could be noticed was, of course, your strength, your physical strength, and this is very obvious in the case of Egil Skallagrimsson. And then there is the case where you showed activity in courts, such as there's one case in Vokktidiga saga, for example. And the second age would be the age of 15. At this age, boys would engage, for example, in stuff like killings, but not only killings, all right. They could also establish a farmstead, for example. That was also considered a great success. However, you are going to notice a slight inferiority, or at least a sense that adults don't really take them as seriously as they would have liked to. So maybe they weren't completely adults, but on their way to becoming like real men, so to speak. Men accepted by society. And we have this one extreme example. I'm going back to Hegel again. And his case is an example of anti-behavior, anti-social behavior. Everything what he does and his whole portrait is extremely exaggerated, and Actually, what he does shows us that these activities were not really that typical. And he is described even by his father as being somebody extremely difficult to deal with. For example, at the age of 3, he gets very angry that his father doesn't allow him to attend a banquet. And he does find a way to infiltrate himself into this banquet, and he impresses everyone with his rhetorical skills and his strength, and he even wins a small prize from his grandfather. And perhaps the most famous episode regarding his very antisocial behavior is what he does at the age of 7, because he kills someone at the local games at the lake. These were sort of regular social events where local men challenged each other, wrestling and other sports, and they also organized such events for children, or at least this according to the saga. And there is some point where they're trying to organize themselves, and all the boys pair up to take part in the game. And Egil takes the son of Heg from Hegstadir, who is said to be 10 or 11 and very strong for his age. And Egil gets beaten at the game by this older boy, and he reacts very violently. So he essentially takes an axe and cracks the skull of the son of Heg, and this is going to bring about a lot of trouble, because a lot of people are going to die following what Egil does. So, like I said, here you have an extreme example of social behavior, so with reference to what you shouldn't have done. All right, I'm going to closely come to the end of this presentation with a question I kept seeing in a lot of contexts, so maybe it would be a good idea to tackle it a little bit as well. And that is the question about sacrifices. Were children sacrificed in the Viking Age? Because we know for a fact that human sacrifice was practiced. We have a lot of references to that, both from archaeological and from literary sources. I can think of one example. If you read the Ynglinga saga, which is the first saga from the volume Heimskringla, written by Snorri Sturluson, there you are going to find the example of King Aun, who sacrifices his sons in order to prolong his life. So it may be that children would have been also involved in such sacrifices of fertility, or in this sense, we can also think about this possibility because, like we've discussed before, children didn't seem to be children until somebody accepted them, until their fathers accepted them. So there is a possibility that they weren't considered as animate beings up to a certain point, up to the naming process and the sprinkling with water. And maybe in this sense, it would be logical for them to appear in archaeological contexts, such as the sacrificial wells from the site at Trelleborg. This is a fascinating site. There is a great military fortress here at Trelleborg in Denmark. It was erected by Harald Bluetooth. It was part of his great undertaking of constructing these fortresses, these ring fortresses across the whole territory of Denmark. But underneath this fortress, there seems to have been a ceremonial space, so prior to the erection of the fortress. And recently there have been cross-disciplinary investigations. I found one report from 2014 documenting the pre-Christian Viking Age on this site. And we have sacrificial wells, 2 of them, including the skeletal remains of children. So we have 4 local children. Apparently, new analysis shows that the children actually come from the territory, or at least in the vicinity of this territory. And this is very interesting because they don't seem to have been chronically ill or suffering some kind of illness, and they don't display trauma signs either. That is not to say, however, that they didn't suffer at all from some kind of disease, because some diseases do not transmit, do not show in the osteological remains. And if they have no trauma signs, that doesn't mean they weren't involved in some kind of violent act either. But, well, at least the preliminary study suggests that they didn't really have any problems of the sort. So anyway, the deposits where they were found are very rich deposits because they contain a lot of animal bones, for example, and as well as other human bones, some remains of adults as well. And this actually indicates the fact that it would have been a pre-Christian ritual site. And this would be important for us to understand the transition from the pagan to the Christian religion. In the sense, it would have made sense for Harold Bluetooth to raise this, to erect this fortress here, because it was his way as a Christian king, as being the one who Christianized at least part of Denmark, to show the transition to a new, not only to a new religion, but also to a new power. So in the sense, completely covering the old ritual site with something he did would have been highly appropriate. So to answer your question, yes, it would seem that children would have been, well, at least sometimes sacrificed, probably in relation to some kind of fertility cult. These are not the only ritual wells we have. There is another royal residential complex at Tissø, and this is very close to Trelleborg, and we have wells also here documented. So yeah, it would seem that this idea would have also been embedded in the mental world of these people.